Thank you all for coming, even during exam week. It's a real honor to be back here. And, for perspective, I think this institution is almost 1,000 years old. And it's based on the premises of free speech, private property, individual liberty. And those values, those rights are under attack. And I think we have a real competition of governance between a people that are free to choose how they're governed versus living under a more tyrannical or elitist dominated form of government. And so as I see what has happened now in Ukraine, the debacle that's in Afghanistan, I just want to step back and think about what should have happened, what needs to happen so that we return to an actual form, a legitimate form of deterrence, because otherwise these things can spin out of control very quickly. I think it's important to think, as the United States went into Afghanistan, you also have to think about how we got out. And when you think about after 9/11, President Bush met with his National Security Cabinet 5 days after at Camp David. And present were the CIA director, the Secretary of Defense, the State Department, and the National Security Council people. And while their headquarters was still smoldering, right, the Pentagon's was still literally smoldering from the 9/11 attack, the best they came with, right, the most expensive military in the world, they wanted to do some bombs and missile strikes in Afghanistan. They wanted to wait for another 6 months and do a very conventional invasion of Afghanistan via Pakistan. And the CIA said, no, Mr. President, give us the money and the authorities, and we'll get this done. And that's exactly what happened. And in a matter of weeks, less than 100 special operators, some of whom were British, backed by air power, smashed the Taliban, literally put them on the run, and that worked. And then the Taliban were very scared, on the run for the first 6 to 8 months. And then when the Pentagon really moved in and Bagram Air Force Base became a saluting zone, we kind of went into a same repeated loop of the Soviet battle plan that failed for the next 19 and a half years at trillions of dollars of cost and failure. And so by never embracing or never having the serious introspection about how do we get here, how do we get out of this effectively, is extremely frustrating. I knew Steve Bannon for a few years from a book event I did. And so I've been writing policy papers for him before the 2016 election. And he came to me in the spring of 2017 and said, please write up a different policy for how to get out of Afghanistan because the president is serious about ending this. And so I wrote an op-ed, and the president read it, circled it, called in the National Security Advisor, said, I don't like your plan, because at that point the National Security Advisor had asked to send another 70,000 troops into Afghanistan. And he said, do this. And so it became an internal debate between kind of an unconventional approach for keeping the Afghan security forces upright and more effective versus the stay the course and just more money and more troops. Well, eventually the more money and more troops thing ran out, and President Biden just ended it without any real thought about how fast it would collapse. And I just want to reflect on what I did recommend, because it's germane to how to look at some of these problems with an unconventional eye, right? If you think about, at that point there was 100 and some battalions in the Afghan army, and they've been losing terrain steadily because they didn't have reliable air support, their pay was stolen, their ammunition was sold off, and the diesel fuel was filtered away as well. So there was a lot of corruption that permeated that force. And so all I recommended was to do what the special operations community had been doing effectively in training Afghan forces, and replicate that and leave it behind using veterans, right? Everybody loves the word veterans. Contractor is a more controversial term. But because the U.S. and Nato had been through 31 different troop rotations, they never had the continuity on the ground with those forces. Our model is we can send those veterans back and they can live with that battalion for years and years and years. They're in with a unit for a few months and then home to see their families and then back in, but always to the same valley with the same unit. That kind of presence and continuity, that brotherhood in arms, living with, training with, and yes, even fighting alongside their Afghan counterparts. Just 5%. It's actually the same model that the East India Company used next door for a couple hundred years. Second, some reliable air power, but again, air power that showed up reliably, no room for the excuses of, well, we're out of parts, we're out of fuel. When your men need help on the ground, you have to go with no excuse. But our model was to use professional pilots flying the aircraft, Afghan pilot as the safety officer, Afghan pilot always maintaining the weapons release authority. So it's not a contractor taking that shot, it is an Afghan service member. And third is just to control the combat logistics piece of it, right? If you can pay a man on time and feed him on time, and you get them reliable health care when they're shot or they're wounded, they're going to fight better, more effectively. An Afghan soldier was 7 times as likely to die if they were wounded than a NATO trooper. And so that's just wrong. And so our approach was take over and manage the pay distribution, get rid of the ghost soldiers, make sure they have food, fuel, parts, ammunition on time. That's what systemically failed. For all the smart people in Washington or in Europe that were saying, well, we have no idea why the Afghan military collapsed so quickly, it's because they stopped getting food and fuel and parts, and most of all, ammunition. Afghan Air Force ran out of ammunition in June and July of that year already, last year. And so, of course, no pressure on the enemy. Now the Taliban can go from grouping at groups of 20 and 50. Now they can do 500 and 5,000 and 10,000, and they rolled up the country. So an example of what didn't have to be, right? Because that stay-behind force I talk about costs less than 5% of what the U.S. was spending alone. In fact, the U.S. Congress dispersed 4 times as much as that program would cost just to pay for Afghan refugees for 1 year. So again, it's not a matter of cost, it's a matter of innovation. Second, on things like Ukraine, I had a pretty good idea the Russians were going to do something. We saw lots of indications outside of any U.S. intelligence sources. And so I gave a plan through some Special Operations Command people that I know to get to the White House last December already. And it's a simple version of Lend-Lease. And if you're British, you know exactly what Lend-Lease was, right? Because in Britain's hour of need, the U.S. gave them valid equipment, destroyers, tanks, aircraft, guns to defend themselves against Nazi Germany. And this year, already planned, the U.S. Air Force is retiring 200 combat aircraft, okay? F-15s, F-16s, those are frontline fighters, air superiority capability, and 42 A-10s, the finest anti-tank aircraft ever made. Already planned to be retired this year, this fiscal year, literally flown to the desert and parked for eternity. I said, look, take those aircraft, take some of them, fly them to Ukraine, and you can repaint them in Ukrainian roundels. Of course, carrot and stick. Tell the Russians, of course, Ukraine will never be part of NATO, fine, but they're going to have the means to defend themselves. If they had any package of those aircraft and that kind of capability, the air superiority, dominance over their own airspace, I don't believe the Russians ever would have invaded this whole debacle in Europe, right? Because think about it, the peace and tranquility enjoyed in Europe for the last 75 years is gone. It is peaceful here now, but it is not so peaceful not that far from here. 2 days drive at most. And so I want to talk tonight about how to restore deterrence and how to go back to a rules-based order. As you think about, Russia had been doing kind of resorting to muscle and guns again. They in the last few years, you see a lot of reporting about the Wagner Group, which is a Russian private military contractor. The Russians actually pitched me in 2011. They invited me to Moscow. This was during the Great Reset, during the Obama administration. And they said, please come and build a Blackwater-like capability in Russia. I said, well, thank you, but I can't do that. And I went back. And sure enough, a couple years later, they roll out the Wagner Group, which employed a lot of Russian contract soldiers. And they, now Wagner Group has grown into a real hybrid capability from doing propaganda, media messaging, to training, capacity building, up to full-on combat forces. And they used them originally in 2014, of course, when they seized the eastern part of Ukraine and Crimea. They've used them in Madagascar, in Central African Republic, in Libya, in Syria. And and now again in their assault on Ukraine. So they're maximizing that. As you think about the debacle that we're in with this standoff in East versus West, Russia has significant energy resources, and they're going to find a way to sell them. And I think I'm worried about the United States, especially backing itself into a corner on this, because of all the sanctions that we laid out. Only 30 of 166 countries have actually honored those sanctions. And there's a real likelihood of a block, right? They call it the 3 R's of the ruble, the rupee from India, and the renminbi from China, that they form a bigger trading block to trade energy outside the dollar zone. That will have significant effects on the United States economy, the United States military, et cetera, because the reason Congress can appropriate way too much money every year is because the dollar is the world's reserve currency. When you lose that status by other currencies growing more influence, that will have a very severe effect in Washington. So deterrence matters in preventing this kind of stuff from happening. In China, right, you also have the dangers of a rising power and I would say a declining or static power in the United States. If you think about China, over the last 20 centuries, China was the largest GDP in 19 of those 20 centuries. Okay, just the 20th century was an anomaly. Some severe setbacks between the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, and those things wrought on by collectivization and the real misdeeds of the Communist Party. But China is seeking to return to its normal status quo as the Middle Kingdom in the center of the universe. And so there is real challenges for the East and West as we embrace that. With in my travels in China, I met the CEO of the state-owned enterprise that actually built all those islands in the South China Sea, right? Because they kind of sprung up out of nowhere, and he acknowledged, he said, it was never even part of our wildest plan, our wish list. But we found the Obama administration didn't provide any deterrence. We found them so vapid that we went for it. And they built all those islands, and of course they said, well, it's just going to be for weather and for trade reporting. No, they're fully weaponized now. They effectively built lots of little Malta-type military bases all across the South China Sea. I understand why they did that. I mean, every problem that came to China from 1840 until 1949, they called the Century of Humiliation, right? First the Opium Wars with Britain, and then some conflict with the United States, and then the Boxer Rebellion and the problems in the late 1800s, and then of course the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy that invaded in the 30s and the 40s. All of those problems came by sea. So just like they built the Great Wall of China to stop Mongol herdsmen, cavalry from coming south, this time they built a maritime Great Wall. But again, a lack of deterrence, lack of consequences implemented by the West allowed them to do that, and it shifts the balance of power away from a lot of those regional allies. And so as these countries interact, and if we don't have deterrence, if we don't have normal rules that people expect and consequences, a lot of conflict can result. So with that, I will take questions and talk to Charlie. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Prince. That was very interesting. Just to touch on something you said at the end there in terms of lack of deterrence, and linking it back to how you started with talking about Ukraine, do you think there is a discernible line that can be drawn between Georgia 2008, Crimea 2014, Ukraine 2022?
I think it's a consistent path. Look, love him or hate him, people, at least those foreign leaders, viewed Trump as a wild card. They weren't quite sure what he was going to do. And I think the lack of response in building those islands in the South China Sea, the lack of anything on the first invasion of Ukraine, right? There was really no consequences for any of the so-called red lines in Syria when Assad was dropping chemical weapons on his people. Again, no consequences. And so unless you can manage consequences, then deterrence breaks down. And I think the Chinese Communist Party relationship with America was kind of one where they were moving their fence into our yard about 6 inches a year. And Trump said it was at least wanted to say, hey, knock it off. Let's negotiate trade deals fairly, stop the intellectual property theft. There wasn't nearly enough done on all those things. But look, the free trade and capitalism works great as long as both sides are agreeing to a common set of rules. But if it's state-managed capitalism on one side and a free market non-support on the other side, that's going to cause these kind of imbalances, which is why you have so much of the U.S. manufacturing heartland that's been decimated and outsourced to China.
I'm getting some angry looks. We'll quickly wait until this is moved before we continue. Save our live stream and YouTube audience.
Thank you.
So obviously you've put part of the blame there on the Obama administration and the lack of deterrence resulting from that. Do you think some of the blame...
It's not...
not just...
It's not fair. I would say it's the same tenured so-called smart people that we have in the national security apparatus that rotate, sadly, between Republican and Democrat administrations. Most of the people that Trump had in his national security apparatus were the same tenured, qualified class. And my frustration is the lack of innovation, the lack of spine is what got us to this situation.
Do you think there's some of the blame for this lack of deterrence lies as much with Europe as it does with America? We had a speaker a couple of terms ago who was talking about the evacuation of Kabul and was saying how there were concerted efforts, at least made by the United Kingdom, to stay in Kabul for a while longer after the United States decided to withdraw, but there was no appetite for staying from other European nations. Do you think that a complete lack of spine from European leaders has resulted in Europe being no force for deterrence on the world stage? Well,
I'd say the fact that the Germans decided to still close 3 nuclear power plants last December to keep to some Green Deal mandate that they had imposed on themselves, making them further dependent on Russian energy, was not a very good step towards deterrence. It's not I can't imagine Moscow determining that as a serious step to say they want to maintain their flexibility to not have Russian gas. Of course. So and they've continued to buy. I know there's talk about sanctions against or an embargo against Russian gas now, but that's still not done, and there's still enormous amount of euros flowing in the direction of Moscow, paying for that energy. The fact is, any country, the program, the Stay Behind program I laid out, could have been sponsored by any European country because it wasn't that much money. It was a couple $2 billion, right? That's a lot of money, of course, but relative to what was being blown in the effort there, it was a pittance. And so that's something Denmark could have afforded if they wanted to do that. But no one, I guess there's the danger in all sitting in a community is that you depend on, maybe it falls to the lowest denominator instead of rising to the highest. I mean, look, NATO, of 28 countries, only 5 of them were spending 2% of their GDP on defense. So yeah, there is a bit of a freeloading factor of a lot of European countries. Germany, one of the most egregious about it, not taking their defense seriously. When Germany doesn't even have a couple hundred tanks that still function, when their operational readiness of their aircraft is in the almost single digits, it is a really, really bad look. And it's just not a serious, they're just not taking their own defense seriously.
Do you think 2022 will mark a turning point for this? So Germany's announced it will meet 2% spending on GDP on defence. They're building main battle tanks like we know Germany can. Do you think that this will mark a turning point?
No. I don't think their bureaucracy is even, I don't think the politics and their bureaucracy is even swung into motion yet. And look, for all the talk that the U.S. has been doing, the ugly fact is that about 5% of all the weapons promised to Ukraine from the United States have been delivered. 5%. For all the talk of all the M777 long-range howitzers from America, actually great ones made in Britain, owned by the U.S. military, shipped to Ukraine, can't use them because there's some key parts that are missing, right? So again, there's a big gap between talk and reality, and that's my frustration with the national security apparatus. If it's just plain politics, it's awful because it undermines credibility of the United States and of any Western country that says, yes, we'll stand behind Ukraine. Look, we don't have an obligation, nor any NATO country should have an obligation to send troops to back up Ukraine. But as imperfect as their democracy might be, corruption and all the rest, The fact is, Ukrainian people voted with their bodies to show up and defend the country, and that's admirable. And I've also heard that the Biden administration had signed off already in March on a deal to let the Russians keep all the east and all the south, including Odessa of Ukraine. It is, to me, that's every bit as egregious as Neville Chamberlain selling the Sudetenland to, trying to buy peace with Hitler. It's a really bad look and a really bad move, and that is the opposite, the inverse of deterrence.
Do you think the post-invasion response from NATO is what Putin expected?
I think, no, the biggest problem I think the Russians had was they kind of believed their own nonsense. They believed their own intel, and they thought they'd be greeted as victors, and they rolled in very quickly. They thought they would roll in very quickly, and that there would be systemic collapse. The fact that Zelensky opted to stay and kind of rallied the Ukrainian people was not expected. Even their air assault into the Antonov airfield on the west side of Kiev, it had all the hallmarks of a debacle, and it was kind of a smaller version of what the U.S. and the U.K. tried in Holland in 1944 with the Arnhem airborne invasion, which was also a debacle.
So, looking at that, do you think that there will be no consequences in the long run of the invasion of Ukraine for NATO and Western defence? Or do you think that the moves made by, for example, Sweden and Finland to make NATO applications will result in some long-term shift in the alliance's focus and motivation? I think
the border countries all take it very seriously now that the Russians can make aggressive moves against them. I think they saw it in Georgia in 2008. Maybe it didn't really apply to them. They saw it in 2014. Maybe they thought that was just a one-off. Now they know it's real, and so whether you're the Finns or the Swedes or the Poles, all those people on that frontier take it very, very seriously, and so they're going to wake up, whether Germany does or not. But I think you could have economic leaders of Europe, and you'll have military leadership in Europe, and it's probably not going to be Germany. It'll be the countries that are taking it seriously and preparing.
So in terms of the military unpreparedness of Europe and the United States, this is something that you've been talking about your entire career, at least since the founding of Blackwater. Where do you think, other than rule by bureaucrats, the big flaws lie in Anglo-American military preparedness?
I think it's any bureaucracy becomes thick and syrup-like, right? And the failure to adapt to new tactics or new tools. And I look at what Azerbaijan did the fall of 2020, right? They had a long-standing conflict with Armenia over the Nagorno-Karabakh. The Armenians seized it from them in the early 90s. And finally, the Azeris, after a long negotiation, willing to buy it back, decided they were going to take it back. And it worked. And it was the first time in warfare that you had nearly that extent of armed drones going after armored vehicles, and they went through a lot of that high-dollar Russian equipment like a knife through butter, and it was very effective. It was a 44-day campaign, and it led to a decisive victory. That's the kind of lessons that Western militaries still have to wake up and learn, that reality is in the here and now, and that preparing for a fold-to-gap 1960s, 1970s era of ground combat is probably past.
So last year, the United Kingdom passed the National Defence Review, which pivoted defence spending away from the army and towards particularly the navy, but also the RAF and parts of drone warfare. In the same year that the UK commissioned 2 new aircraft carriers, a project that's taken 15 years and cost billions and billions of pounds. Do you think that represents do you think the focus on navy and air is a step forwards, or do you think that it represents being stuck in the past and seeing things like aircraft carriers as status symbols?
As we saw, any ship is a very expensive target, and when you have the Moskva, right, the Black Sea flagship taken out by 2 Ukrainian-made missiles, the Neptune missiles, and a second ship that was taken out largely by a drone, by a small TB2 drone shooting a small anti-tank missile that made a strategic shot to ignite munitions on board. The danger of operating any large vessel that's not stealthy in an era of precision weapons makes it a very, very expensive target. The same problem the U.S. Navy has with those carriers. So I would probably argue for more of a submarine capability, because I think as we're seeing on today's modern battle space, where everything is videotaped from satellite, synthetic aperture radars, airborne radars, all the stuff, the enemy has lots of targeting data. And your gemstone type systems are extremely vulnerable.
Moving on then from military specifics and the last few years, I want to talk about Blackwater and your sort of experience of founding it. So you left the Navy SEALs in 1995? Six, and then founded Blackwater the following year.
Right.
What was the process that led to you, A, leaving the SEALs, and B, founding Blackwater?
Well, I joined the SEALs after college, and it was a great experience. I love the SEALs. I'd planned to stay in longer, but my father died and my wife got cancer all within 6 months of each other. And so I got out to help my mom sort out the business and obviously tend to my wife. But the SEAL teams have been using private facilities since the 1970s, small ones, right? And no one had done it on an industrial scale, and I kind of knew what the SEAL teams needed, so I knew nothing about business or government contracting or real estate development, but what could go wrong? So I went for it and built it. And you go back to the same well that hired some of the guys I worked with from the SEAL teams, my training officer and firearms instructors, and built the facility. And our first big government contract was actually after the Navy had a ship attacked in Yemen, attacked by a suicide boat. We ended up training almost 100,000 sailors how to protect their ship, because the Navy had really gotten out of the business of doing firearms. So that was our first one, and then when Iraq and Afghanistan and Iraq happened, we just served our customers wherever they need us to go.
Do you think that Blackwater prompted a long-term change in the role of private companies within US foreign policy and global military policy?
No, what changed the need for contractors was you went from a massive Cold War standing military to one with much reduced manpower, and so you still had a lot of support services that had to be done, whether that's as mundane as mail service and laundry and food and fuel and that kind of stuff, but even a lot of the niche training applications. And the need for our kind of support was especially accentuated because when you go from a conventional military invasion, right, rolling into Iraq, and then retasking an armored combat brigade into being a peacekeeping brigade, taking a guy that does chemical warfare or air defense artillery, that's his specialty in the Army, hard to make that guy into a bodyguard or to a police trainer. And so finding companies that can find niche private sector talent and apply it to areas of government needs, that's what we did.
You said, when asked a few decades ago about the founding of Blackwater, that it was partly prompted by the Rwandan genocide. And the quotation I think you said was that seeing it really bothered you, and it made you realize that one can't just sit back and pontificate on these things. Do you look back on the last 2 decades and think that Blackwater has made a distinct and positive impact to stop things like the Rwandan genocide?
Well, I had friends in Executive Outcomes, which is a South African private military contractor that could have stopped the Rwandan genocide. They'd been very effective in ending the war in Angola. They'd ended the slaughter in Sierra Leone by the Revolutionary United Front. I mean, guys that masterminded long sleeve and short sleeve amputations and burning churches and just terrible mayhem. They stopped that with 250 people. Okay, and in 6 months after they went in, the fighting was done, and another 6 months later, there was free elections in the country again. So yes, private contractors could have stopped the Rwandan genocide. There's a lot of other applications. I mean, after I sold Blackwater in 2010, I advised on a counter-piracy program, right? Because Somali piracy was raging off the coast, all over the Indian Ocean. 80 to 90 ships taken per year. Crews held for a year, 2 years at a time, and that program was stopped for less than the pirates were taking in ransom per year. Okay, it's funded by the UAE. They a maritime trading nation. They wanted to see it done, and it was done. And so, with all the drama from the UN and I would say the forces of status quo, I would say protecting the incompetent ways to do it. Right, the same UN that let the Rwandan genocide happen, that let lots of other slaughter and mayhem happen in Africa. the same ones that were actively working against us, trying to stop to stop piracy from Somalia. That's my frustration with those kind of forces, because there's a hugely entrenched bureaucracy that is comfortable with the way things are, because people make a lot of money off of it. And I would rather put the fire out rather than just manage fires, because there's the suffering of millions of people goes on for way too long. Put those fires out.
If that was the sort of thing that drove you to found Blackwater and grow it across those 13 years, how does it feel to know that it is now associated in people's minds with war crimes and with being a mercenary group?
Well, there's a great lack of understanding from most people that have not served in the military or served in combat zones. And the problem in America, you have 1/2% serve in the military, another 3 or 4% that know the person that served in the military, leaving 95% of the people with no idea of what actually happens in combat or how dangerous it is, nor know anyone that actually serves. And so seeing how grossly distorted the media portrays things in the world, it is what it is. I know what the truth is. My people that were working out there know what the truth is. The people we've rescued hundreds, if not thousands of times, know what the truth is. And it is what it is. But I think battlefield contractors have been maligned for centuries. But they're still necessary, and people still call them when they're needed. One of my favorite parts, knowing that it would be controversial doing a counter-piracy program in Somalia. We sent a film crew along, and they filmed everything, the training, driving to the missions, etc. And it's called the Somalia Project, and it actually won a prize at the Toronto Film Festival. But my favorite part of that movie, and there's an Indian kid in his 20s who's interviewed, and he'd been held captive for 1.5 years on a ship. And he said, one day we heard shooting, and we heard a lot of shooting. And then we heard a helicopter, and we knew someone had come to rescue us. And he said, we prayed to God, and God finally sent the PMPF, the Puntland Marine Police Force. After all the noise, all the spending, all the other nonsense by the EU, the US government, chasing pirates all over the Indian Ocean, that little unit, the Puntland Marine Police Force, got it done and rescued that crew and lots of other crews like that and ended piracy. That unit went active in 2012. And you really don't hear about piracy off the coast of Somalia or in the Indian Ocean after that. So moments like that make it very, very satisfying. So however grossly mischaracterized battlefield contractors are, or mercenaries, if we were allowed to put out the fires raging in northern Nigeria, right, when you see 300 girls kidnapped for the mere crime of going to school, or the people blown up constantly in southern Somalia for going to a hotel, going to the wrong mosque, or whatever. Or if we could have prevented the debacle, the embarrassment of Western civilization that happened in Afghanistan, you can call me a mercenary all you want. Give us a chance to do that, and I'll take that title all day long.
Do you therefore reject claims that PMCs need further regulation internationally?
Say that again?
Do you reject claims that PMCs need further regulation?
Sure, they can regulate all they want. That's like saying you want ISIS regulated in the sense of you want people behaving well on the battlefield. You do that by sending honorable people that have the right experience with the right leadership and the right mission and the right incentives. For the people that say PMC should be regulated, they can make lots of noise about the Wagner Group, the Russian PMCs, who are doing all kinds of things in a lot of countries with complete impunity, unless there is consequences, unless there's an enforcement mechanism to actually stop the Wagner Group or ISIS. ISIS, in that case, acting as a surrogate of other interested countries in the area in the Middle East or funded by them. Unless there's consequences, you can't make that stop. Right? I remember taking my kids to Dachau, right? The first concentration camp in Germany. And on the front gate of Dachau, there's a plaque to the 1st Armored Division and the 29th Infantry Division. Okay, 29th Infantry Division came from Virginia, which is where we used to live. And I said to my kids, look, this horror that happened in this concentration camp stopped not because of international conventions, not because of the Red Cross complaining. It happened because men with guns and tanks came to this concentration camp and made it stop. And so if you're going to let contractors do that, call them mercenaries, or if you're going to send an actual qualified UN peacekeeping force to actually do it, or if you're going to send a division of the British Army, fine. But send one of those, but put the fire out. People that want to throw stones at contractors, it's not a fair argument, because sending people to put the fire out, like my friends from Executive Outcomes, when they arrived in Sierra Leone in the early 90s, and they heard gunfire right outside the city because the Revolutionary United Front had taken over the entire country. When the first 60 of them showed up, the people of Freetown, Sierra Leone showed up in a parade because somebody was finally coming to defend them. Do you think the people of Rwanda would have cheered anybody, contractor, 82nd Airborne from the United States, or the UN, would have showed up to cheer somebody that came to stop and to defend them from being slaughtered? In Rwanda, the United Nations, for all their bluster, allowed 1 million people to be killed by farm tools in 4 months. That's a staggering number. So talk is cheap. Put your boots on the ground and make something happen, and then have a conversation about who's doing what and where.
If you were Chief of the Defence Staff in the United Kingdom or Commander-in-Chief in the United States, where would you deploy boots on the ground right now?
Where what?
Where would you deploy boots on the ground? Where would you intervene? Where do you believe we have a responsibility to protect?
Look, so there's a difference. I'm not saying send forces to all these countries against their will. I'm saying if you provide a continuum of capability to support national sovereignty of those countries, right? I'm not going to send forces to Nigeria to invade, no. But if you provide them the means to stop the kidnap gangs that are grabbing dozens or hundreds of girls regularly, to put that fire out. Or, Somalia, for example, raging now for 20 years, an Islamic criminal gang, Al-Shabaab, lots of ways to put that fire out. Again, Somali government wants help. The U.S. has sent more U.S. forces, but they're going to be very, very impaired from going outside the wire and actually getting after those terrorists. One of the real problems, even with the I would call it Western government support, has been an obsession with trying to kill terrorist leadership, instead of looking at ignoring the fact that if you take out the head, there's always another snake head that regrows. And instead, if you look at going after their logistics, their finance, and their personnel, making it unsexy to be a terrorist or guerrilla in that environment, that's the ways to reinforce that national sovereignty, not in an interventionist way, always voluntary, supporting a legitimate government that wants to improve the livelihoods of its people.
It seems that there are lots of things that you're proud that Blackwater has done or could have had the opportunity to do across the last 20 years. Is there anything that you regret being part of or ashamed that Blackwater has done?
Not ashamed. I'd say hindsight for the betterment of the business. I never would have worked for the State Department. I don't think they really wanted to be there. They never appreciated the work we did. We did more than 100,000 missions. No one under our care ever killed or injured. And when things got difficult, they threw us under the bus. So if I could send a note back to myself in 1996, say, avoid the State Department, they're just not worth the trouble. The DOD, the other federal agencies we worked for, no problem. But with that one, I would definitely take a different path.
And on a personal level, you've spoken quite a bit about Kabul, the evacuation, and also about money as a motivating factor in conflicts. I'm sure you know where this is going. It's a question submitted by one of our members. You famously advertised in August last year that you were selling chartered flights out of Kabul for $6,500 each. Do you think it was right to do so? What was your thought process behind doing so? Well,
again, we were not an NGO. We did not have any donor money to fund the loadout of an aircraft. And so if people wanted to buy partial loads of a chartered flight, that was far below what most people were charging for hauling people out of an aircraft. Look, I don't own any $300 million C-17s, so we have to rent a a 737 or a 757 or something like that and pay the pilots enough to take a risk to fly into Afghanistan, and you have to pay the insurance for the operator multiple millions of dollars to take the risk of flying their aircraft into an very active war zone that's just been taken over by the Taliban. People that scoff at that number truly have no understanding of how costs of these things work. That was a fraction of the number that of the costs that were entailed.
Very quickly, before I open up questions to the audience, a few more questions on the world order going forwards rather than over the last few months. Joe Biden said in the last few weeks, he reaffirmed the United States' commitment to defend Taiwan in case of invasion. Do you think that if China was to launch a naval invasion of Taiwan next week, NATO would defend it?
NATO would defend it?
Or the United States? Both.
Well, here's the thing. The fact that Joe Biden has talked about all these defense articles that they're providing to Ukraine, but they've only provided 5% of the headline that's been announced, I would be worried if I were Taiwan. Now, the difference, these are the things standing in Taiwan's favor. Amphibious invasions are hard, probably one of the hardest military endeavors to do. You heard a lot of noise maybe about a river crossing that the Russians tried that did not go well. They made some other river crossings work that did not get the press as well. But crossing a river is one thing. Crossing 70 miles of open ocean is difficult. I checked the wind today. It was 23 knots in those straits, which will make for some serious waves. And so, logistically getting troops over the beach into Taiwan for the CCP, difficult. Resupplying from the United States everywhere else, also difficult. The tyranny of space and distance and time and weather and the deterrence of all those precision Chinese missiles, the D-21s. If I were Taiwan, first of all, they need to take their defense seriously before the U.S. should ever send any troops. And they don't even spend 2% of their GDP on defense either. They should own their defense and take it seriously. They should do a very serious home guard because amphibious invasions are a math problem. It's an industrial problem, right? You have to get a lot of men and materials over the beach and sustain them and support them. If you can provide the variability of not being sure that you're going to succeed in those first 2 days or 3 days, advantage to the defender. Second, I would complicate the undersea efforts that would an invader would face with proper submarines and mines. And third, they have to find some solutions for deterrence in the air. But I would not, if I were Taiwan, depend on a U.S. president, any U.S. president of any party, sending thousands of Americans to defend Taiwan. That's just, I don't think that's realistic.
Would you be in favor of a permanent U.S. military presence in Taiwan?
I don't think it's necessary. I think Taiwan can defend itself. They can, if they're serious about it, they can spend the money for the tools and train their people. And this island managed to defend itself for many centuries and millennia. They can too.
One final question before I open it up, which is, I suppose, a global strategic question, which will also help with my essay next week. Nuclear proliferation. Do you think that going forwards the next few decades, the P5 powers, those legally able to have nuclear weapons, are waning in global status, or at least 3 of them are? Do you think that will usher in a new age of nuclear proliferation? And do you think that has positive impacts on global security?
I think that with the MOU that was signed with Ukraine, I think in '97, where Europe promised to guarantee Ukraine's border security, border integrity, in exchange for them giving up their nuclear weapons, has proven to be a huge error on Ukraine's part. And countries with nuclear weapons tend to not be invaded. And so it will be a huge incentive for countries to figure out how to go nuclear, even if it's small, to have that deterrent factor. So I would say the lack of deterrence that's been demonstrated over the last 20 years will inevitably point more people to getting nuclear weapons, because that's the only real deterrence that matters.
Ladies and gentlemen, if any of you have any questions, please raise your hand or your membership card, and one of our committee members will come and bring you a microphone. Please stand up and ask your question. Do we have any questions for Mr. Prince? I have plenty more if you don't. The gentleman in the front row.
Thank you. I was just wondering, with Russia and the U.S., we don't have as many, economic ties as we do with China or Taiwan. I'm American, by the way, and I'm guessing with Taiwan, we also have they have the leading semiconductor industries, and we have a chip shortage. And I guess giving up Taiwan would give up the technology to China. And there's so many more economic implications if China was to try to invade Taiwan. And I'm just wondering your thoughts on, would that cause the American response to be greater than, and I guess more serious than we've done towards Ukraine?
Well, of course. I mean, our economy is hyperlinked to China's, and it's not just chips out of Taiwan that would cause that, but the secondary and tertiary effects if the CCP were to move on Taiwan and to take it. Remember, China imports about 90% of their energy, okay? Gas and crude coming through pipelines out of Northwest Asia through Xinjiang province, from the north out of Russia, through Myanmar, and a lot by ship. All of that immediately becomes vulnerable and able to be interdicted. And so the second and third order effects of that kind of conflict drives China, mainland China, that if they're going to do something, they're going to have to do it. They have to know it's going to be fast and it has to be successful. And if it's not, then the CCP is kind of betting all of it. They're betting all their cards on that being successful. And so that's a pretty high level bet. That being said, seeing the lack of aggressive response by this administration regarding Ukraine, right? Because there's rhetoric and there's reality, and there's a big gap there. That I wouldn't be surprised if the mainlanders move on Taiwan sometime before the 2024 election.
Next question, the member in the front row.
Thank you. Well, if I may, again, just another question about the, you started your talk recalling the successful invasion and execution of a very small force in Afghanistan back in 2001. And I do wonder whether, in a sense, Russia intending to do something similar in Ukraine at the beginning, which then obviously backfired, thanks to things that are still to be analyzed, heralds that conventional warfare is still the rules of the game, in a sense, instead of relying on these small surgical strikes that obviously didn't work out for Russia? Or is that just because Russia doesn't have the similar capabilities for surgical strikes that the US possesses? Sure.
Significant difference. One being the Taliban were a far cry different than the Ukrainian military capacity. If Putin had done this, what he's doing now in 2014, it'd be a very different outcome, because for the last 8 years, the Ukrainians have been in training camp, seriously training camp, because they managed to stop the Russian invasion as far as it got in 14. But it's been a very raw fight since then, and very real. And so they have trained and equipped somewhat, obviously well enough to stop a full-on invasion with dozens and dozens of battalions. So yeah, it's an apples and oranges comparison to say 100 special operators against the Taliban backed by air power. That's a very uneven fight. And so you want, if you're in the special operations world, you want to pick uneven fights, because you have so few people. But for, the Russians do conventional grinding combat extremely well. And they, the German army, the Wehrmacht, was a better army in the 40s, but the Russians still destroyed it by sheer mass and power and combat power, and they just ground through it. And if they can still manage, they're winning now. So far, the weather advantage has been to the defender, right? And I don't know why Putin decided to go in February, when if he had waited until July, he would have had dry fields, right? The Battle of Kursk started July of 1943, the ultimate tank battle, biggest in history, that would have given him, let all his forces get off the roads and disperse and be less prone to all those precision anti-tank missiles lining up along the roads with the way they were. So this will probably grind on for quite a while yet.
I have a follow-up question on that, which is, what weaknesses do you think this shows about the Russian army and about large-scale conflict in general? I mean, the Russian army deployed to invade Ukraine was 3 times the size of the British standing army, and yet has been humiliated and has suffered a huge number of casualties. Do you think that shows that large-scale conventional warfare is doomed, or just that Russia was ill-prepared?
Like I mentioned about Azerbaijan, with the advent of precision weapons, that puts significant asymmetric advantage in the hands of people that have the precision weapons, where you don't have to fire 10 artillery shells to kill a tank. You can fire 1 missile. That changes the math, but there's still a place for true conventional ground combat capability. And people that say that era is gone are mistaken. Just like people that say the tank is dead, there will be ways developed quickly to provide more defense, more capability to defend those tanks, and we've not seen the end of those either.
Any more questions from the audience? Yes, again, sir.
Thank you. A second question. I remember reading something today on on the Wall Street Journal that Russia has expended around 20% of its military capabilities, and I think a lot of us think about the the situation where Ukraine is going to be defeated by just the constant mass of Russian forces keeping grinding through towards Kyiv. But I guess in the alternate situation where Russia is really continuing on this path where it's just grinding through and it's not really getting progress, I think, to what extent do you think that Russia will expend its military forces? When will it stop? And ultimately, if Putin fails, what is his fate, I guess?
Well, Ukraine has been playing defense largely so far, and they've yet to show that they can marshal a maneuver offensive combat capability and sustain it logistically to take back a lot of those forces. Now you hear a lot of reports about how exhausted the Russians are getting, all the rest. I wouldn't bet against the Russian bear just yet. I think it was sanctioning all the oligarchs the way that was. I understand what the goal was, but by taking everything away, it kind of forced them all back into the arms of Putin. I would have sanctioned half their money and said, you get the other half back if you help make a change. So I think lots of reports of whether he is ill or not, who knows? But that is a very, very high stakes game. And the other thing is, assume Mr. Putin departs from a leadership position, what comes in his path? Someone better or someone worse? And so that's a very unknown as well.
Member in the black shirt.
So given sort of your desire to promote more sort of strong deterrent efforts, but also the fact that a lot of these nations have sort of somewhat incompetent military strategies, if you look at the withdrawal from Afghanistan and sort of the fact that only 5% of what's been promised to Ukraine has actually gotten there. Are you sympathetic to those that say that we should cut military spending if it's not going to be used effectively, or do you think that the opposite needs to be done?
Oh, I will loudly promote cutting military spending. Absolutely. The United States military is like an obese triathlete, okay? I'm not the lightest guy. I still run triathletes. I would be better if I weighed 10 kilos less. I'd be faster. The U.S. military would be much better off if we took 40% of the budget out, okay? Because when you throw a lot of money at a problem, you create lots of other dumb ideas and dumb problems that drag you along, that detract from your core mission. If you think about the continuum of statecraft, right? You have diplomats and embassies on one end, and you have the strategic nuclear triad and aircraft carriers on the other, but 80% of it is the intelligence world. And so, Yes, you should have a fantastic military, highly capable, trained, huge deterrent factor that you hardly ever use, right? Because most of these things should be fought by the intelligence community. When Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980, the U.S. policy had been, well, NATO's policy, the West's policy towards the Soviet Union had been 35 years of containment, okay? And he was the first one that said, we're going to F the commies. Enough. We're going to go at them economically, politically, culturally, socially, in every way. We're going to attack the roots of this Soviet communism all over the place, not with our military, but everywhere else. And there was 20 covert action findings that were signed. One of them the one you heard about was the Iran-Contra, which after Congress went through all its noise, reauthorized that program, okay? But those worked and worked and worked, okay? Because remember, 35 years of containment, 1976 to 1980 were a bad time in the West. Afghanistan lost, Iran hostage crisis, stagflation, just bad. Bad economy, bad military setbacks, all the rest. Reagan said, enough, we're going back at them. And that worked. And so I would argue for a spectacular military that never has to come off the bench. Because most of these things should be solved by the intelligence world or special operations with a very, very small footprint, kind of like the first 6 months after 9/11 that you saw in Afghanistan, and leave the conventional military as a true deterrent factor. And it's much cheaper that way too.
Two final questions before we finish up. One that we ask all of our speakers and one specific to you. What are your predictions in the next, say, 2 years for the state of global security?
Less global security. If it was a stock, I would short it. So I think there is going to be increasing spin-offs from the lack of deterrence. I will commend Britain for standing tough and standing tall with Ukraine. The Brits have done the best job in all of Europe in helping the Ukrainians, much better than the United States has. But I'd say the time of misdeeds by the Russians, by the Iranians, and even by the Chinese, we have not seen the last of. So.
And a final question that we ask all of our speakers: if you could give 2-3 sentences of advice to all of our members, what would it be?
To the members?
Yes, to students.
Read well, read good history, talk to people that are practitioners, not just academics. Don't equate a degree, and particularly an elite degree, with experience and competence. I think the national security apparatus in America has all the people staffed with all kinds of elite degrees that have led America into some great disasters. And so congratulations for studying here and learning well, but make sure you're practical in your application of that knowledge.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Erik Prince, thank you.
Thank you.